Welcome again to Sid Caudle from Christian People's Alliance, and we're going to talk today about David Campanale. Sid's got some antecedents here, so he knows this from the inside. I think it goes back, about 14 years, doesn't it, Sid? Tell us the story.
Okay, well, David Campanale is basically one of the key founders of the Christian People's Alliance back in 1999, so basically 25 years ago. When I joined the party in early 2004, he was very much the key figure in leading the party. And it was him that actually asked Ram Gidamal to stand for London Mayor in both 2000 and 2004. So when I joined the party, that campaign was underway, and I joined in and helped out with the campaign and did some campaigning. And it was a great pleasure to do so. And the Christian People's Alliance did quite well. We actually beat the Greens in 2000, and we got quite a lot of votes. But that was... So the party was launched really with a certain amount of favour, because the Evening Standard actually said that Ram Gidamal was probably the best candidate standing for London Mayor, which was quite interesting because he's got a very strong business background, very well equipped to be Mayor of London, which some of the candidates aren't, to be quite honest with you. But anyway, that was the situation. So, and I became good friends with David Campanale. He welcomed me into the party, and I enjoyed working with him. He's very clever individual, and he was working for the BBC, very much a Christian in the BBC. And in fact, the BBC at one point actually said to him, because you're a Christian, you're not going to get promoted, which is not a very nice thing to say. But over time, it became clear that David was very strongly pro-EU, and the party increasingly became more and more anti-EU as time progressed in the going through the 2000s into the 2010s. Alan Craig was also fairly anti-EU, but I don't think it was that big an issue when he stood for London Mayor in 2008 and when he was leader. But as time went on, of course, it became a bigger and bigger issue as UKIP rose in the polls and it rose in their support. And when Alan Craig resigned as leader and we had the election for a new leader in 2012, that was when I was elected. Both candidates, myself and my opponent, were anti-EU, pro-Brexit. And I think at that point, David Campanale decided that his time with the CPA was over. There was new leadership that had come in, and the new leadership was clearly anti-EU, pro-Brexit, and he was no longer felt at home within the CPA for that reason. And maybe understandably, he decided that the place for him was to go back to the Liberal Democrats, which is where he had been before. He'd actually been elected, I believe, as a councillor for the Liberal Democrats previously. So it's unsurprisingly that he decided that, yeah, okay, I'm pro-EU. I want to support the EU in the referendum, if there is one at that stage, I guess. And I no longer feel at home in the Christian People's Alliance, so it's time for me to move on. That's the background.
Right, well, the foreground, of course, is that he's not welcomed once again, and you've had experience of this, I know, in the past, because you're a Christian. You've had it. We don't want you. Now, they don't try that on a Muslim, do they?
No, that's interesting. So obviously, so David left the Christian People's Alliance and joined or rejoined the Liberal Democrats, and stood for them in the general election in 2019. And did quite well, was selected to stand in Sutton and Cheam in the next general election. But then he faced serious opposition from an LGBT group within the constituency who found out that he was a committed Christian. He says that he made it clear all along. I mean, whether that's true or not, I have no idea. But he says, I've always made it clear that I was a Christian and that I was anti-abortion. To his great credit, David Campanale has not compromised on his values. So he's not said, okay, yeah, I'll go along with LGBT, you know, I understand. No, he's basically said, look, I'm a Christian, this is where I stand. I'm strongly pro-EU. I support the values of the Liberal Democrats, but I'm anti-abortion. And of course, there's been many people in the past, like David Alton and Alan Beath, and all these people that have been very clearly in the Liberal Democrats, or in the Liberals as they were before, and took a strong position against abortion. So, you know, there's certainly history in that regard. But it appears now that the Liberal Democrats don't feel like that anymore. Now, of course, Tim Farron, when he was leader of the Liberal Democrats, he was a committed Christian, and he was anti-abortion and anti-LGBT. But they put so much pressure on him that he shifted his position, and actually said, "Okay, yeah, I'll go. I'll be willing to say that homosexuality isn't sin, even though I know it is. I'll say it isn't for the sake of unity in the party." Now, the result of that was when he resigned as leader, he said, I've not been able to be leader of the Liberal Democrats and be faithful to God, to be true to my Christian faith. That's what he said when he resigned. But interestingly enough, he decided to stay on with the Liberal Democrats anyway, which basically asked questions to me, that asked questions, because basically you're saying, look, I haven't been able to be in the Liberal Democrats and lead the Liberal Democrats and be faithful to God, but I'm going to continue in the Liberal Democrats and continue not being faithful to God. I mean, basically is what he was saying. But with the people in Sutton actually said to David Campanale, we didn't know that we were choosing another Tim Farron. That's what they said. So even though Tim Farron is still a Liberal Democrat MP, they're basically saying his attitudes are not acceptable to us.
Sid, have we got a legal case here?
Oh, yeah, quite definitely. Because, you know, under the Equality Act 2010, you know, Christian views, all religious views are protected. It's a protected characteristic. Now, you see, any more than I can come along and say, I oppose LGBT, I will not accept an LGBT person. If I'm attacking the person for their behavior and for their beliefs, it's not acceptable under the Equality Act. Now, I can say that I disagree with your beliefs, but I can't say I disagree with I can't say, well, I'm discriminating against you because of those beliefs, which is what the Liberal Democrats have done. So absolutely they have a case. And of course, you know, the Christian Legal Centre have been brilliant in taking numerous cases to court, you know, where there's been Christian discrimination. And we've had a case in the Christian People's Alliance with Maureen Martin, which I won't go into now, but suffice to say that she was discriminated against by her employer, sacked because she was a Christian, and she had a substantial payout from her employer before the Industrial Tribunal because they knew they were going to lose. So absolutely, David Campanale has a legal case, and I believe he's going to the European Court of Human Rights with his case.
Well, this keeps coming up in many forms, and LGBT, they're always digging away. They don't like Christians, do they?
No, of course not. But you see, interestingly enough, I was doing evangelism last week in central London, and someone said to me, I'm a lesbian. And I said to her, do you want to go to heaven? And she said, why should I want to go to heaven with somebody who condemns me? I said, well, it's up to you. I mean, the simple question is, do you want to go to heaven? She said, no, I don't. So it's interesting. I didn't condemn her. I didn't say you shouldn't this or you shouldn't that. I didn't judge her at all. I simply said to her, do you want to go to heaven? That was just, and you can't be taken to court for saying to someone, do you want to go to heaven, can you? So, but it's interesting, you see, they know that the Bible condemns homosexuality and says homosexuality is sin. I mean, interesting enough, my wife also was working for St Albans Council, and they sent an email round inviting everybody in the council to attend a gay pride parade, including people of faith. And she replied and said, I won't be going because I'm a Bible-believing Christian. That's all she said. Now, her manager then came back and said, you caused offence, you need to apologise. She said, I'm not apologising. All I've said is I'm a Bible-believing Christian. And he said to her, but they know that the Bible says that homosexuality is sin. It's like, well, that's their problem, not mine. I'm not apologizing.
And the outcome of that, Sid, was it just left?
The outcome of that was that she said, I've had enough of working for St Albans Council, and resigned, and got another job working for a big church in London, which she's much happier working for them than she was for St Albans Council. But if the council had taken disciplinary action against her, she had already alerted the Christian Legal Centre and would have taken action, but she resigned before they took any action.
I mentioned Muslims before because, well, this would not happen to a Muslim. Now, why? Well, I'll tell you why. We're too soft as Christians. We don't stand on the truth enough, and we don't fight back.
Yeah, well, that's part of it. But another part of it is, of course, that in Islam, you're allowed to lie in order to gain an advantage. So if a Muslim was in the situation, for instance, that my wife was in, they would have no problem in saying, oh, yeah, I'm very sorry, I didn't mean to cause offense. You know, and yeah, absolutely, I go along with LGBT. It's not a problem. I won't be attending because, you know, I'm extremely busy on that day. But you know, I wish you all the best. You know, I'm certainly happy to apologise if I've caused offence. They wouldn't have any problem saying that. But then behind the scenes, they would say, "Stupid idiots." You know, what do they think they're up to? Because they've got no problem with being double-tongued. And you know, and when they're in a minority, they apologize, but they're looking to the position where in time they hope to be in a majority. And when they're in a majority, there's at least 7 Muslim countries to put all homosexuals to death. But they know full well that if they say, oh, homosexuals should be put to death, they'll get nowhere in politics in the UK. So they don't. They don't say that. They say, oh, it's fine, you do what you want, you know, there's no problem, you know, while they're gaining position. Now, of course, Christians are committed to the truth. So we have to tell the truth. We can't pretend that this is our attitude and change our position behind the scenes. But you're absolutely right. While speaking the truth, we have to have guts. And this is where David Campanale comes back in, because he has had guts. He's had the courage to stand by his principles, no matter what the cost. And other people have. Jacob Rees-Mogg did brilliantly. They tried to put the same pressure on him that they put on Tim Farron. And he just turned around and said, I support the teaching of the Catholic Church. And, you know, they continued to question him, and he repeated, I support the teaching of the Catholic Church. So you're not attacking me, you're attacking the entire Catholic Church. And of course, Christians can say the same. I support the teaching of the Bible. I support the teaching of Jesus. So when you say that, you make it clear you're not just attacking me and my beliefs, you're attacking fundamental Christian beliefs. And then they have to back off.
Sid, let's look at the ladies in politics, in conservative politics. Let's look at Priti Patel, who behind the scenes has been working her way up, allegedly, to take over Rishi when he goes. That's interesting, but she's not the only one. You've got ladies Badenoch, Braverman, and Mordaunt, equally so. They'd like the #1 title. Conservative women are very strong. Where's the men?
Yes, it's interesting, but of course they do stand for very different things. Of those people you've mentioned, the only person, in my view, who's suitable to lead the party is Kemi Badenoch. She's actually done very well indeed on making trade agreements all over the world since we left Brexit. And she's still working very hard making trade agreements. I mean, see, what you want in a leader is somebody who's been successful in their previous job. Priti Patel and Suella Braverman notoriously failed, really. I mean, they had objectives, but they failed to achieve those objectives. So do you really want somebody as a new leader of the party who's failed in their previous job? That's the issue for me, and it should be the issue, I think, for the Conservative Party. As far as Penny Mordaunt is concerned, I mean, she's woke. I mean, so she she offers the Conservative Party an alternative, which is very similar to the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party. I mean, because she's totally in support of LGBT, she's supported transgender, and she supports all this stuff. And when she was Women's Minister, I mean, she made that quite clear. I mean, she tried to change her position, but of course, you know, these days with so much media, and you know, all you've got to do is just to produce interviews from the past and prove that that was her position. So I think Penny Mordaunt would be a terrible leader of the Conservative Party because of her policies, not because of her approach. But she's not actually achieved anything either as a minister. You see, I remember in the time of Margaret Thatcher, when every minister was achieving something. I mean, for instance, they introduced in the 1990s the GP fund holding scheme. You know, we had education ministers like Kenneth Baker, who introduced the national curriculum, who introduced testing, who introduced all these things that were like, you know, radically changed the whole agenda and greatly improved education, you know, greatly improved the National Health Service. A minister that, when they finished as minister, had radically improved the service that they were responsible for. Since 2010, there's no ministers have improved anything at all. I mean, that's the reality of it. I mean, I know between 2010 and 2015 we had a coalition, but you know, there's evidence now of Ed Davey, who was, when he was business minister, was basically refused to meet people from the post office who were facing all these problems. And it's like a minister that refuses to meet people. Oh, because my civil service told me that that they were all guilty, so there was no point in meeting them. Okay, well, you see, a weak minister just goes along with the civil service and doesn't do anything for themselves. A strong minister tells the civil servants what to do and initiates substantial change in their ministry. But that's a classic example, really, of a terribly weak minister. And how Sir Ed Davey can possibly continue to lead the Liberal Democrats and want to be Prime Minister when he's proved to be so totally incompetent in a ministry, I don't know, frankly. But I'm saying all this because we've had, over the past few years, generally very weak ministers in virtually every ministry. And Priti Patel and Suella Braverman have been no exception. They've achieved nothing. And that's why I raised that point. But, you know, I actually very much admire and like Jacob Rees-Mogg. And when he was a minister, he was actually setting about reforming the civil service and achieving things. But of course, he caused an enormous amount of anger in the civil service because of what he was doing. So you have a weak leader like Rishi Sunak that comes along and says, oh, you mustn't upset the civil service, so we're going to have to get rid of you. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg would make an excellent Prime Minister.
I agree with you, but the majority of the nation doesn't, strangely. But is it strange? I've got another question for you related to the girls. 4 out of 5 of them happen to be BAME. Put the Prime Minister in, there's 5 out of 6, isn't it? Any significance in that sense?
No, personally, I don't think so. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, I'm more interested, frankly, whether these people are Christians than the colour of their skin.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a certain toughness, let's be honest about this, from people that come from abroad, or their parents do. They've been through rough times. Perhaps the middle-aged, everything white person has not been toughened up enough.
Possibly. I mean, they've got something to prove. Absolutely. I mean, you know, it comes from a very difficult background. I mean, Swahili, I believe, who has just resigned, who was briefly Chancellor. I mean, he actually said, I came over as an immigrant. So, yeah, I mean, I guess they do have something to prove and will, I guess, work a lot harder than somebody who's born with a silver spoon in the mouth and has got everything laid on a plate for them. And sent to a posh school. I mean, they've really got nothing to prove, because everything has been given to them. So yeah, I mean, there's doubtless some some truth in that, but I'm frankly not really interested in the colour of somebody's skin. I'm more interested in their effectiveness as a minister, which is why I think Kemi Badenoch deserves to be leader of the Conservative Party.
Not a lot of mileage, though, yet with her. That's the chief criticism. Listen, you mentioned JRM, Jacob Rees-Mogg. He's in bother, even though he's working, or because he's working for GB News, because people are out to get him. They have been industrially so in the last 2 or 3 years for various reasons you've mentioned one. But the thing here, of course, is that you're required to be in the media with your own show to be completely even-handed. There's got to be no bias. Now, how on earth people judge what bias is? Even David Lammy, who appears on LBC, has got himself in a bit of trouble. But it's what can I say? The GB News disease. They're determined. I shall explain in a minute, are determined to get that station off air. Now, who's the chief protagonist against these people and against GB News? Well, it happens to be people in the Labour Party. Surprise, surprise. And they're poking Ofcom every day of the week with complaints, either manufactured or real. You only need to look at the advertising on GB News and see the paucity of it. Now, that is a real scandal, Sid, that people should say don't advertise on GB News, and they do, because you'll regret it. We'll put our muscular trade power against you as a company if you dare advertise. That needs investigating. That needs bringing to court, Sid, not GB News.
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, I've got no time whatsoever for Ofcom, frankly, and I don't. Well, you may be absolutely right about the Labour Party sending them complaints, but I think Ofcom are absolutely going down the wrong path, and they put enormous amount of pressure on Christian TV stations if you dare to say anything which is contrary to the new age liberal agenda. Ofcom have threatening to put Christian television stations off the air, so it's not surprising that they're putting pressure on GB News for stupid reasons. I mean, the main reason that they're saying is that, presenters like Jacob Rees-Mogg aren't allowed to read the news or disclose any breaking news item. So they're allowed to interview people and to have debates and discussions, but they mustn't read a breaking news item. Well, it's just nonsense, isn't it? It's just frankly utter nonsense, because what harm is Jacob Rees-Mogg causing if he says, oh, we've got breaking news. We've just heard that the Russians have been attacking Kharkiv and have broken through the border, and the Ukrainian forces appear to be serious trouble. I believe we got a report coming in. What's wrong with Jacob Rees-Mogg saying that? I mean, it's just ridiculous. And of course, that's why David Lammy's also got into trouble, because he read a breaking news item. But so what? I mean, the whole thing is utter nonsense. And by the way, while we're talking like this, I'll just tell you my personal experience with Ofcom, because I was interviewed on BBC at the time of a general election, because at a general election, the BBC have to interview all small parties or none. And they wanted to interview the Women's Equality Party, probably the National Health Action Party, parties that are friendly to them. So if they're going to interview those people, they have to interview the leaders of the other parties. So they had to interview me. So they had me on, leader of the Christian People's Alliance, welcome me on. They started asking me some very tough questions, but that was no problem. But as time went on, they sabotaged me with Owen Jones, who completely ignored everything I'd said and just launched into a diatribe attacking me for opposition to LGBT, making out that I'd said things which I hadn't said at all, and just basically came out with his anti-Christian agenda. And when he finished talking, the BBC turned around and said, right, we'll have to end the programme there. And if you've seen the interview, I mean, I just turned around and said, that's not fair. You basically allowed this man to attack me and not giving me any right of reply. And interestingly enough, the interviewer turned around and said, well, if you want to complain to Ofcom, complain to Ofcom. That's what she said. And I did. I complained to Ofcom because I basically said, look, any respectful journalist, if they want to attack somebody, has to give them a right of reply. That's a key part of proper journalism. And I said, here I was attacked, viciously attacked, and I was given no right of reply. Ofcom turned around and said, you did reply. I said, what? Well, all I replied and basically said, you're not giving me any right to reply. They said, well, you did reply. So as far as we're concerned, there was no problem. I mean, and I'm just thinking, whoa. So the BBC knew full well, if I complained to Ofcom, I would get nowhere. Then Ofcom basically blatantly lied about what had happened in that interview.
Yeah, I hear lots of complaints about Ofcom. We've been curiously dealt with over another issue, which is wickedness, quite frankly. But that's where they're coming from, Sid. We move on. There's talk at the moment about tightening up, let's call them free speech laws. What's happened? People are getting really fed up. The election's coming up and they're getting fed up with people gluing themselves to bridges and M25s and everything else, and pouring paint over pictures, whatever. And the law needs tightening up. And so they've done it through, inverted commas, even freedom of speech. But I regard this as extremely dangerous, Sid. The laws are already there, in my opinion, to get hold of these people and indeed, in some cases, bang them up. But the police do not do it. We're in real danger of here, again, of creating so many laws, so much confusion, and it's not needed.
Well, yes, but you see, we've got police commissioners, and in London, the police commissioner is the mayor of London, and police commissioners do have a certain amount of power. I mean, I know because there's been my friend Angelique Foster, who's been police commissioner for Derbyshire. Unfortunately, she lost the seat in the recent election, but that was not because she hadn't done a very good job. That was simply because the political climate turned against Conservative leaders, and she was actually doing it in what was a fairly Labour area generally, so she did very well to win it in the first place. But anyway, that's by the by. The point is, police commissioners do have power to actually direct the police as to what they should focus on. And in London, we've had this ridiculous situation with Sadiq Khan, who is basically applying 20-mile-an-hour speed limits everywhere, supposedly to reduce pollution, has introduced this ultra-low exclusion zone. So any older cars are basically charged £12 a day if they dare to appear on the road, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of people are very much opposed to what he's doing. But it's hardly surprising when you've got somebody like that who's in charge of the police that he's basically saying, oh, yeah, leave climate protesters alone. Any climate protesters are welcome to protest in London. You mustn't stop them. That's basically what's going on. And of course, it's also not surprising with somebody like that who is a committed Muslim, that the police in London are also arresting Christian street preachers, even though the Christian street preachers have never, not a single one, has ever been convicted in court, because the courts have said that you've got no right not to be offended, and the police are arresting them for causing offence. So what the police are doing is wrong, absolutely wrong. What the police are doing is wrong in relation to these climate protesters. But as long as Sadiq Khan is mayor of London, it's not going to be stopped, I'm afraid. That's the reality of it.
Yeah, let's go to Tony Blair, from the sublime to the sublimer. He's recently stated in an interview with the Times, I'll quote, autocracies are fine with smart leaders. Now think about this. Think about the World Economic Forum, who will be the next leader. He's strongly tipped. He goes on to say that democracy can deliver us from the ultimate catastrophe, he insisted on in his interview. But it's a problem today because he says old-fashioned politics don't exist, and trying to deal with them in a modern world, we need a a benign dictatorship? That's what he really means.
Yes, I am extremely concerned about everything that Tony Blair stands for, quite frankly. He is somebody who is totally committed to a one world government and is pushing that agenda with all the finances, all the money he can get. He's pushing the World Health Organization. They want to have complete control over every country in any future pandemic, and no country will have a say as to what they do. The World Health Organization will make all the decisions. They want the economies of the world to be under one roof. They want climate change, of course. I mean, climate change can't be dealt with by one country on its own. So, of course, we've got to have international rules on climate change of who can do what in order to reduce emissions. This is Tony Blair's agenda. And it's frankly a satanic, evil agenda. And it's akin to the Antichrist. I mean, I a long time ago thought Tony Blair himself might be the Antichrist, but he's certainly an Antichrist figure. I mean, people might think that's extreme, but that's been my opinion for a long time.
These are strong words, Sid.
Well, I'm afraid that's how I see him. I mean, you see, when Tony Blair was standing, you know, to be the Prime Minister, interestingly enough, if you remember, we actually had those pictures which were put out of, you know, satanic eyes. And, you know, people looked at his eyes and they saw something satanic in his eyes. And that was actually put out, you know, by the Conservatives in the election. And he was also frequently known as Beliar. You know, Blair is Beliar. And, you know, what we now know that he basically completely lied to the House of Commons over Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. You know, at the time, people thought obviously what he was saying was true. And there was a reason for us to engage with Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein. But we now know that all the reason he was giving for removing Saddam Hussein was completely false. It was just lies. So the man is dishonest. And I'm afraid Jesus told us that Satan is the father of lies. So, you know, the fact that I'm now saying that I believe that a lot of the stuff that Tony Blair is doing is satanic is unsurprising given his history.
Well, certainly his wife was into all sorts of allegedly occult dealings, dealing with another world. So the legacy has carried on because in many ways it's coming back to bite us, the Tony Blair era, in many, many ways. What we've got now with the woke society, it started then big time. But that's a discussion for another day. I've got something here for you that brings us bang up to date. 2.5% of GDP is the defence strategy of the Tories, which improves it from 2.25%. Doesn't sound a lot. Well, there are big billion numbers here. Keir Starmer's not prepared to do that. He's leaving his flip-flopping again in the way of everything. But we're in a mess, Sid. Half our boats don't work. Half our Navy employment doesn't work. There's not enough Royal Marines. A big discovery this week that should have been on every single newspaper, nobody bothers with it, is the oil in Antarctic. Now we own, inverted commas, quite a big slice. The Argentinians are complaining already about that because they're claiming this much of the same stuff as we technically own. It's an agreement here. It's not absolute ownership, but it should progress on that basis. Australia own the biggest part of Antarctica, but strangely, Russia have been nosying down there, and they found the biggest oil deposits you can imagine. Where? In the Weddell Sea, where Shackleton's ship sank. And we own it. And they've discovered 10 times as much oil as there is in the North Sea. Wow. Now that's headline news. Forget it. You might find it on page 9. But here, actually, Parliament knows about this. And there are two sides of MPs within the Tory party. One is worried. One of them says, oh, Putin will go away. No, he won't. He's got no business being down there in the first place. he's clearly stirring it up. And the ideal way of him stirring it up, of course, is to get on the Argentinian side and start causing trouble, because the Falklands Islands are very strategically placed as a midway point to getting the oil off Antarctica. So lots of things are going on here. Half the Tory party say Putin's all right. The other half are breathing reality. This is going to come back and bite us big time, Sid.
Now, if we can address first the issue of defence spending. Now, it's quite interesting, you see, that we've highlighted the fact that in 2010 we were spending 90 billion on Quangos, and that figure rose to 224 billion last year, which in real terms is an increase of 65 billion pounds. Now, in real terms, it basically means that if you say, you know, how much would 90 billion be today, in you know, if you increase it with inflation, you get a figure of roughly 160 billion. So there's 65 billion. If you go up to 224 billion, then it's increased beyond inflation. Now, that's an enormous amount of money. Now, interestingly enough, when Keir Starmer's answer to the problems of immigration is he's going to set up another Quango. It's going to be the immigration Quango to supposedly deal with immigration. So, which just goes to show what the Labour Party are after, more Quangos. Now, unless we actually get to grips with this, I mean, interesting enough, Jacob Rees-Mogg recently was decrying the fact of how totally inefficient the Financial Conduct Authority are, another Quango, which of course used to be the Financial Services Authority, but they split it into two and created a new Quango with the Prudential Regulation Authority as well as the Financial Conduct Authority. The whole thing has just been aimed at increasing the number of Quangos and increasing the amount we spend on the Quangos. And if we get to grips with this, we'll have plenty of money to spend on defence. And absolutely, our focus should be on defence, on the health service, on education, on the key services. And we need to, all we need to do with all these Quangos is basically have a look at them and say, right, we're not funding you anymore. We've even got Wilton House, which is a Foreign Office Quango. Why do we need a Foreign Office Quango, for crying out loud? Just basically say we're not funding you anymore. If they want to continue, they'll have to find private funding. You also find out there's people like Stonewall. Stonewall are into most of these Quangos. So most of these Quangos are giving money to Stonewall to advise them on what pronouns they should use for their staff. I mean, it's just farcical. And you even have key people that you hear of that are basically ejected from one Quango and then move on to another Quango. You know, if people don't know what we're talking about things like Social Work England, the Teachers Regulation Authority, the National Standards Authority. I mean, there's 12 education Quangos. We don't, you know, these Quangos don't run schools. They don't actually do any teaching. I mean, they're supposedly advising schools. I mean, we don't need people to be advising schools and advising teachers. We have governors, school governors. They have their responsibilities. You know, we don't need any of these Quangos. You know, frankly, well, we don't need many of these Quangos, I should say, not any. We don't need many of them. So we're going to turn around to them and say either we're stopping funding, or in other cases, we're reducing your funding, you're spending too much. And that way we save billions. Yeah, literally.
We've got to use the get out of jail card free here quite liberally and say allegedly there is interaction between the government, their pals and friends that are in the Quangos. Circumstantial evidence maybe, but if you really dug deep, allegedly you're going to find a big setup here, which was demonstrated, of course, during the pandemic, big time, with procuration.
Yes, interestingly enough, the one person who did highlight the issue was Liz Truss. But you see, when she became Prime Minister, instead of actually announcing, right, I'm going to cut quangos and I'm going to use this money to cut taxes, instead of doing that, she just cut taxes and didn't tell us where she's getting the money from. If she'd have announced she was cutting quangos and she was going to save 65 billion from cutting quangos or some similar figure, and she's going to use that money to cut taxes, there would have been no run on the markets. She'd still be Prime Minister now.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Let's move on to British Rail, as it used to be called, and will be called something similar, Sir Keir says, when they get it. Craftily, he's letting the franchises run out because we can't afford the billions to pay the present owners off. But what a mess, Sid. We're going to go back to another monopoly. You name any monopoly that's not failed in the United Kingdom or anywhere else for that matter. We still got a monopoly, of course, with British Rail. You've got a monopoly in the London Midland region, the East region, the Western region. It's still a monopoly. How do you get around it?
Well, I think the first thing I would say on the railways is that they're working way better now than they were under the British Rail that we had in the 1970s and the 1980s before privatisation came along. I mean, there's literally no comparison. And see, it's only young people that don't remember British Rail that are basically saying, oh, we should nationalise the railways. I mean, nationalising the railways, for crying out loud. I mean, really. It would be a complete and utter disaster. I mean, from my personal experience on the railways, and I use the railways a lot, I think they are running extremely well. The service that we have from Hitchin, frankly, is brilliant. We get a fast train into the centre of London every 15 minutes. Okay, I mean, it's reasonably expensive. It cost me £22.90 for a ticket that includes unlimited travel on the underground as well. It cost me that amount per day, which is not cheap, but I get a very good service, and I'd rather have a very good service that I pay a little bit for than have a terrible service, which is what we had under British Rail, with awful trains that were breaking down all the time, and most of the time they weren't running. I mean, the actual quality of the trains was abysmal. The quality of the track was abysmal. We had major safety issues with trains crashing. I mean, it's what we actually need now on the railways is a lot more freight, frankly, because there was a time before we had all the railway strikes when an enormous amount of freight went on the railways. And if we had more freight on the railways, then they'd have a lot more chance of making a profit. And we have got some freight on the railways, but we had a lot more freight on the railways than off the roads. It would help the roads, decongest the roads, and make the railways a lot more profitable.
We've got to tackle something a little bit normal. Well, I'm saying we've got to tackle things a little bit different. We always go to soccer one way or the other. Let's quickly get into there, and it's soccer with a difference. It's Gary Lineker, of course. Who else? He's never seen anything like the situation in Gaza. Since he was born, there's never been so much blood and guts, and now he's not been paying attention, as he said. There's an awful lot of blood and bullets been fired during his lifetime, and he simply ignored the real world. Yeah, it's the real world, Gaza, but nothing compared with many other things that are still going on now, whether it be Ukraine or many areas of the world with greater bloodshed. But he should be talking football, Sid, and not politics.
Yeah, I mean, I used to admire Gary Lineker enormously as a footballer. I think he was a great footballer and greatly to be admired. He was a great asset to the English team, and you had to admire him. But as a politician, he's just terrible, frankly. And what he's saying about Gaza is complete nonsense. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, there's a lot more people are dying in Ukraine, but there's a lot more people dying in Sudan as well. There's a lot of other. There's a lot more people dying in Nigeria, believe it or not, with the number of attacks going on of Christians in Nigeria, which is abysmal, which is terrible. But they're trying to make out that Gaza is far worse than it is, producing pictures. I mean, someone sent me a whole load of pictures which they've been putting on Instagram, supposedly, of Gazan children that have been killed by the Israelis, and they're blowing it up to be, to be something which absolutely it isn't. I mean, the Israelis have been warning everybody before they've been doing attacks and literally saying, clear this area because we know we're going to be removing the tunnels from this area, so you need to leave this area. And that's been going on throughout the war, and civilians have been helped no end. One of the things which I don't understand, well, I understand, but I think he's wrong, I should say, is the way Egypt has closed the Rafah border and is not allowing anyone to leave Gaza to go into Egypt, other than apparently people that pay a very high price. I mean, I believe it's something like £10,000 equivalent, which you have to pay in order to cross the Rafah border into Egypt. So, which obviously most Palestinian civilians can't pay that price. Now, if they actually allowed refugee camps inside Egypt, then that would be a lot more humane and would make it much easier for the international community to supply aid to the Gazans who need to leave the areas which Israel is having to clear because of Hamas's operation. That is what ought to be happening. And everyone's blaming Israel and saying it's terrible what Israel's doing. But of course, it all started with Hamas. And if Egypt didn't close their border and they allowed the Gazans to escape the fighting, as they should be, the Gazan civilians, then there wouldn't be anything like the problems that they are facing.
Yes, indeed. Very sad and very telling. You can pay £10,000 to get over the Dover Straits, can't you? Yes. Finally, we go into Wales. There you go, and a bit of a history lesson here, and a bit of a fascinating one, because Wales has always been number 2 in so many things. They've got a terrible NHS health service, education service. The one feature at the moment is the extremely high suicide rate. Let's do a bit of digging. Let's get your comments shortly. We go back to World War One. And to look at the economy of Wales. The coal mines that down there were doing awfully well. The area was thriving. The actual unemployment rate, believe it or not, 2%. Golly, that's better than we are now. So things were going well. And then World War One. Very busy supplying coal in World War One. Well, there was a meeting in Versailles about reparations. On behalf of the Germans, they've got to make up for what they've caused. And there were 4 or 5 world leaders there, one of them from the United Kingdom. And they decided in their wisdom that, Germany has a lot of coal. It's got to be distributed now at half price around the rest of Europe. So we could all gain by that some reparation. A year on, unemployment rate had gone from 2% to 52% because nobody was buying Welsh coal or any coal in the United Kingdom, of course. Guess who was responsible for signing that agreement? David Lloyd George. Liberal, one has to say. Now, you know how much we in Wales hate the Tories. Strange that, isn't it? So everybody was put out of work until the Second World War, when, of course, we couldn't go to Germany for 50%. In fact, 6 years before the outbreak of the Second World War, Germany said, go away, we're not paying our reparation anymore. But there again, the coal mines literally lit up with work, and there was good news for South Wales. And then what happened at the end of World War II, things were back to normal. Now, a bit of a history lesson there, because, of course, everybody thinks of the steelworks 2,800 people just laid off, owned by Tata, Indian company, and it's like Manchester United, I suppose, owned by the Glazers. They're not interested in anything, allegedly, except the bottom line, the dollar. Same as the Indian owners. So many firms owned by overseas companies. And we've got a problem here, Sid, because it's really going to affect South Wales in particular. The history lesson teaches us so many things. Margaret Thatcher poured billions, even billions actually, into South Wales to get some modern technology going. But there is a deeper issue here, Sid. We are constantly being mean, is the right word, in our dealings and in our tradings. And much of the world is. 20 years ago, America was warned. China are winning World War III. Oh, what does that mean? Well, you're going to them for all your goods and they're going to tie your hands in the next couple of decades. And the whole world. They're going to sneak in everywhere, whether it's education systems or anything from Hawaii, who was stopped, of course, in Britain, only because the Americans said there is a real risk here. And they made us basically quit Hawaii and all their devious dealings in the internet and associated parts. We are coming to China because we save 10% on what we buy in goods. Nobody can produce goods worldwide like China. They get slave labor. Let's call it what it is. So it is cheaper for us to go there. But we've not listened to warnings, neither have America. Have they won World War III, a proxy World War III? There are big problems here, Sid, for the immediate future.
Yes, you're right. You see, and what we should be doing is pouring massive capital investment into our industry. We said in our European manifesto in 2014, if we leave the European Union, we should immediately have a massive capital investment in our industry to rebuild our industry so we can compete with the world. Now, we don't have to have a situation where everything is produced in China, because these days with robots, with artificial intelligence, you can produce much more with far fewer people, provided you have modern factories and modern machinery. And that's what China has done. They've invested phenomenal amounts of money in their industry, producing new industries and producing very efficient industries. Now, Britain has lagged behind with productivity. And this is, I'm afraid, where we come back to quangos, because we've been investing all our billions in these quangos instead of investing them in new machinery, in new steelworks, in new shipbuilding, and so on and so forth, in new car building, which all these things is what we should be investing in. And, it's not difficult to solve these problems. It's very, very easy to solve these problems. We've got to have a radical shift in our mentality. And I'm afraid that there's no party that's got close to getting to grips with these problems, including the Reform UK. They've got no idea. I mean, they're talking about drastic cuts in income tax, and they're going to get the money from reducing the budget by 5% of all government departments, presumably also reducing 5% in our defence spending, reducing 5% in our spending on education, reducing 5% in our spending on the health service. That's not the answer. I mean, that's going to be disastrous, that approach. The Conservatives have got nowhere near getting to grips with it. The Labour Party are going to make the situation far worse. I mean, because as I've already said, they're going to introduce new quangos. They're not interested in investing in our industry. They're more interested in renationalising the industries, like we're talking about the trains. I mean, spending billions, buying industries would be absolutely, utterly farcical. And by the way, while I'm talking like this, we've had a similar situation here in Hitchin, because we actually have the Hitchin Council here, run by Labour and Liberal Democrats. And we've got a shopping centre, which is called Churchgate here in Hitchin, which is old, dilapidated, doesn't fit in with the town at all, needs knocking down and completely rebuilding with housing and new shops. That's what it needs to be done. And the obviously logical thing would be to give it to private developers. The council's purchased Churchgate, so it's now owned by the state, and they've just done absolutely nothing with it since they bought it. So it's just continued to be run down and dilapidated. You see, they've got completely the wrong approach. And, you know, it's quite interesting. We stood in the local elections here on, you know, we will get things done in Hitchin, which we would. And I tell people it's not difficult. All you've got to do is just bring in a private developer and tell them this is what you want. They'll make loads of money out of it, and we'll have a lovely new development. You know, and that's what needs to be done writ large in the whole country.
Well, Sid, I mean, wash your mouth out, please. You've just said the unforgivable, that a developer will make lots of money. Now, you can't even become half the Tory party to see how unpopular that statement is, because half the Tory party are socialists. The socialists are veering towards communism. They very nearly did it under Corbyn. Is this the root cause of many things in our society?
Well, I think they've been deceived by the civil service, frankly, who the civil service basically have this socialist agenda, and they're not going to depart from the socialist agenda unless a strong leader like Margaret Thatcher comes along and says, that's not the approach we want. This is the approach we want. I mean, it's been proven. We've got to cut revenue spending, and we've got to increase capital spending right across the board. That's the right approach. And that's what produces wealth. It will produce phenomenal growth in the country. We can get growth in the UK similar to growth in China, like 8% a year, if we simply adopted the approach I'm talking about. I mean, you know, it's not difficult. It's quite simple. And you know, unfortunately, all the political parties are basically saying, "Oh, Britain faces incredibly difficult decisions. You know, we've got massive problems with inflation. We have to have high interest rates in order to get rid of inflation. And you know, we've got very difficult decisions on what we spend our money on. You know, they're not difficult decisions at all. I mean." The other thing, by the way, is the fact that, you know, in 2012, when the Liberal Democrats had a say in things, they decided to impose social requirements on all government contracts. The Adam Smith Institute just said that's now costing us 35 billion a year, these social requirements on government contracts. I mean, that's something else. I mean, this is where China has just slimmed everything down, focused on radical investment, radical amount of construction, and as a result of that, they're able to produce everything far more efficiently and do everything far more efficiently. And because the world is a much smaller place, it's not surprising that companies say, in order to compete, we're going to have to produce everything in China. I mean, the only answer to that, frankly, is serious tariffs. But the true answer in the long term is to invest in British industry, and it's quite simple.
Yeah, what a lot of people don't appreciate is I'm often asked this question: why does America seem to go on with all the problems that are here in the UK, social problems, spiritual problems, physical problems? They've got the same. Maybe some people are saying they've got the same on steroids. Bigger country and bigger problems in their cities. But how do they keep succeeding commercially? Well, the answer's simple. When we say the Democrats are socialists, the Republicans are conservatives. Wrong. They're both conservatives. The difference between them is not what we've got in the philosophy of what we've got in Europe. There are no socialists compared with what we've got in Europe. Socialism is, let's say, mild communism. And it does not work, Sid. It's holding Europe back, and especially the United Kingdom. A quick comment on that.
Well, I don't totally agree with what you said about the United States, because the United States faced massive problems with stuff being sent to Mexico. And it was Trump that actually really took some decisions to get to grips with that. I mean, he cut taxes. I mean, got very, very high taxes on business. He cut those taxes. and imposed tariffs on businesses that were producing everything in Mexico to bring all the businesses back to the United States. And he was doing very well before COVID struck. So he basically had 3 years where he was absolutely reforming American industry, and the economy was being transformed by Trump. The problems that he faced, of course, was with the deep state that was trying to oppose what he was doing, but he made enormous strides. And people can see that, funnily, even if now in the United States, most people can see that Trump as president before COVID performed extremely well. Of course, Biden, when he talks about it, pretends that everything that happened in COVID was all Trump's fault. that's what he pretends. In fact, that's what he says. Trump killed 200,000 Americans, because that was the numbers that died in COVID. And Trump laid off all these people that were working in industry. COVID was all his fault. He's got them all back to work. I mean, it's all lies, frankly. And of course, Biden has been actually disastrous for a lot of American industry, cancelling oil pipelines, having all this crusade against any fossil fuels and so on and so forth. He's done a lot of harm to American industry. But Trump has the right approach. And if Trump comes back into power, I think you'll see American industry go from strength to strength.
Sid, thank you. As usual, we've overrun. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.